5 Americans being held in Iran are one step closer to being set free. The U.S. struck a deal with Iran to swap 5 Iranian prisoners with the Americans. The U.S. also agreed to unfreeze $6 billion of Iranian funds. Now, the arrangement has been in the works for a month, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken officially signed off on it last week.
Meanwhile, Congress was only notified yesterday on the 22nd anniversary of 9/11. This, according to the AP. Critics balked at the brokered deal. Republican Senator Joni Ernst posted her reaction on X, writing, quote, "This will only greenlight Iran's illicit actions and encourage further hostage diplomacy. Biden's failed strategy of appeasement must end." Joining us now to break it down is Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Dr. Trita Parsi. Welcome, Dr. Parsi.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, help us get a little background on the situation. Who are the people that are being released first and foremost?
So these are ordinary Iranian Americans. Many of them lived in the United States. One of them lived in the Middle East, traveled to Iran, visited family, were essentially taken hostage. One of them has been in jail in Iran wrongfully for more than 7 years. And to the point of, that releasing this money that is Iran's own money would fuel more hostage taking, I think it's important to keep in mind that these 5 Iranian Americans, at least most of them, were taken long before the money was confiscated by the United States. Some of these statements by U.S. politicians that oppose this still seem to suggest that that the release of this money will fuel more hostage taking, as if those hostages were taken after the money was taken, but it's actually the other way around. So there's no evidence that this in any way, shape, or form will increase that. On the contrary, what we have seen in the past over the course of more than 20, 30 years of U.S.-Iran relations is that as bad as the relations get, that's when you see, unfortunately, this type of hostage taking increasing. So if we actually want to end that, then we should be working towards having a more normal and constructive relationship, which of course would address the many differences between the United States and Iran, but would move them towards resolution rather than intensified conflict.
So is this arrangement a sign we are moving in that direction? Obviously, we've had you on the show many times in the past to discuss, the kind of disintegration of better relations between the U.S. and Iran. Is this a sign we're maybe, going back in the direction of what you thought was a good foreign policy?
No, I think, unfortunately, at most, this will end up being a bit of a pause. The escalation between the two sides had gotten quite intense. We saw that with taking of Iranian ships, Iranian proxies attacking U.S. forces in Syria, etc. So this is trying to climb down from that, at least temporarily, but in and of itself is not an indication that we are trying to move things towards a positive trajectory. It's a necessary step towards that, but I don't foresee any major movements by the administration in that direction, at least not before the elections. In fact, the only priority administration seems to have in the region before the elections is to move forward with the Saudi-Israeli normalization, not to necessarily resolve deeper problems with Iran.
I mean, this continuing bad relationship or devolving relationship with Iran, I wonder if you could speak to the relationship between that reality and the news coming out of the BRICS meeting in South Africa last month, when Iran was invited along with 5 other countries to join the economic alliance, an alliance that is a move toward financial independence from the United States and the West, and freedom potentially from the West having control via sanctions, holding up money in the way that was done and now is being undone to get these hostages back. Is the diminished relationship between the United States and Iran part of what has pushed Iran, along with a number of other countries, to be seeking this kind of financial independence, economic independence?
Oh, certainly. If you take a look what happened in the 1990s and the debate in the United States when the United States first started imposing extraterritorial sanctions in Iran. The debate back then was riddled with arguments that said this is a move that will punish the Iranians, will impose a lot of harsh economic measures on them, but ultimately will push them into the arms of Russia and China. 25, 30 years later, we see clearly that that has been the broader outcome of this. The Iranians are still there, and much of their foreign policy has become more problematic from a U.S. standpoint. And now they're clearly moving much closer to the Russians and the Chinese, particularly the financial sanctions have incentivized all of them to develop a non-dollar trade mechanisms. At the same time, I think the BRICS, including Iran, shows another thing, which is that from the 1990s, mid-1990s and forward, the United States was the gatekeeper of who is in the community of nations and who is a pariah. The United States almost single-handedly could decide whether one country had a pariah status or not. With Iran, despite its massive human rights abuses, despite what happened last year and continues to happen in terms of them brutally clamping down on women's protesters, joining the BRICS is a clear indication that the United States has lost that gatekeeping capacity of being able to say who is in and who is out. This is a new reality, a world that is certainly moving away from unipolarity. Whether it's moving towards bipolarity, multipolarity, et cetera, remains to be seen. But the unipolar capacities that the United States had in the past are clearly gone at this point.
You mentioned the criticism this arrangement is receiving from many politicians. This is the Biden administration is doing this, so it's receiving some knee-jerk criticism from Republicans. At the same time, Republicans have criticized Biden for being maybe too hawkish toward Russia in the funding of what's going on in Ukraine. There's been a lot of appetite among the base, at least some appetite, for a different foreign policy that's less hostile, less military focused on confrontation with Russia, at least, less so China. There's obviously much appetite for confrontation there, at least among the political figures. It's harder to see, again, among the base. And obviously there's a base of Democrats who want the same thing, often being at odds with the elites in both parties. How should supporters of more normal relations, a more diplomatic, peaceful relationship between the U.S. and Iran, try to recruit like-minded people on both the Democratic and Republican circles, given that there is this appetite in other contexts?
I think you're quite right, and you're pointing to something that is quite a discrepancy on some on the Republican side, who otherwise are standing strongly against forever wars, don't want to see foreign policy entanglements with no end, et cetera, et cetera. Iran ends up becoming a very clear and big exception for them oftentimes. And I think to a very large extent that is driven by Donald Trump's own pet project on Iran, in the sense that he pulled out of the JCPOA as a retaliation against Obama, wanted to undo everything Obama had done, and then elevated Iran to become essentially an identity issue, in which some of these other considerations don't really come into play, which is quite odd because war with Iran would be one of the biggest forever wars and would be far more devastating war than war with Iraq or Afghanistan. So you should clearly see a strong interest on the Republican side not moving in that direction. However, I think for many of them, this is just seen as a cost-free political maneuvering in which the criticism wins them certain support in certain places, but doesn't really risk moving it towards a military confrontation, or at least not in a way that they would be held responsible for it. It's still, in my view, an irresponsible approach to this, because we cannot constantly be on the verge of some form of military confrontation with Iran and at the same time say that we think that that is a policy that makes us safe.
Have you been following these statements made by various candidates in the Republican primary about Iran? And do you have a sense of which are perhaps doing this identity-based saber rattling and which are expressing sentiments that are genuinely dangerous, or maybe the saber rattling is also dangerous?
I've not seen any particular nuance amongst the Republican primary candidates at this point. And again, where you would find nuances are likely going to be on other foreign policy issues than Iran. Iran is essentially the toughest one for them. And again, Trump defines this field very much, and anyone who would try to inject a degree of nuance on this issue would not only come up against other very entrenched interests on this issue, but also up against Trump. And I'm not seeing anyone in that field that has that would like to make that calculation. Ultimately, I think it's a major problem because it's quite fascinating. If we actually had a better relationship with Iran, which in my view, first and foremost, would loosen the grip of some of the most hardline and some of the most repressive elements inside that country. They are the ones that truly have benefited from a confrontational approach. That is part of the reason why they themselves are constantly trying to escalate and raise the tensions between the United States and Iran, because they benefit from it. And our playing into that has also benefited them, of course. But if that were to be broken, it's really quite fascinating to see some of the parts of the United States that would benefit the most economically from having a much more open trade relationship with Iran are actually primarily Republican districts, both states and congressional districts, primarily because of their agricultural industries, which would be a prime supplier of agricultural products to Iran if sanctions were not in place.
Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.